I'm Art Levine, the Senior Vice Chancellor for the Health Sciences and the Peterson Dean of the School of Medicine, and I'm delighted to be here today as we celebrate the appointment of Dr. Bruce Rollman as the UPMC Endowed Professor of General Internal Medicine in our Department of Medicine. Dr. Rollman received his baccalaureate degree from the University of Pennsylvania and his medical degree from Thomas Jefferson University in 1988. Bruce served his residency in medicine at the University of Maryland, and he then pursued a fellowship in general internal medicine at Johns Hopkins, where he also earned a Master of Public Health degree. Since Dr. Rollman left Hopkins and joined Pitt in 1995, his research has focused on the development of new methods and new techniques to treat depression and anxiety disorders in non-psychiatric settings, and he's been unique in this regard. He's investigated the use of computerized cognitive behavioral therapy, and he has explored the effectiveness of a blended care model that simultaneously treats depression and congestive heart failure. He has also studied the use of internet support groups as a treatment for patients with depression and anxiety. Bruce is the founding director of the Center for Behavioral Health and Smart Technology in our Department of Medicine. Since 2015, the center has facilitated research on health issues at the intersection of clinical medicine, computer science, health services research, and healthcare delivery. The center is an excellent model of interdisciplinary collaboration. It links investigators and clinicians from across the university's schools of the health sciences with researchers from our Katz Graduate School of Business, Carnegie Mellon University, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, and a number of local healthcare startup companies, among other entities. Dr. Rollman has been elected to the Academy of Behavioral Medicine Research, a most prestigious honor, and this year he was named a Fellow of the American College of Physicians, an equally prestigious honor. And in 2013, he was an invited speaker at the White House Behavioral Health IT Innovations Conference. I do want to note that, in my view, and I believe the view of many others, Bruce is a unique figure in American medicine. I know of no other person trained in internal medicine who has in fact been exhaustive, contemplative, and highly creative in dealing with disorders that are ordinarily left only to psychiatrists, but not to the many physicians who see patients with these disorders in a non-psychiatric setting. So with that in mind, I'd like now to add another well-deserved honor to this list by presenting Bruce with a medallion. Bruce, if you'll come up, we will hang the medallion around your neck. Hopefully you will remain erect, and we'll recognize your appointment as the UPMC Endowed Professor. Thank you. So usually I have to hang that medallion around people who are several feet taller than I am. And so I'm very grateful, in addition to your achievements, Bruce, for not being very much taller than I am. So please join me now in welcoming Bruce to present his talk, Creativity, Clinical Trials, and Finding the Wow Factor.
Thank you. That was really beautiful. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Thank you, Dr. Levine. And I've been to a few of these presentations before, and usually people have the thank you notes at the end. And I'd like to do something a little bit different and kind of put the thank yous at the beginning. So there are a number of people to thank. To begin, I'd like to thank Dr. Kapoor, my boss and the man who hired me 22 years ago. He had a dream for building a great division of general and internal medicine, and it's just been fabulous to be here. I want to also thank his boss, Dr. Mark Gladwin, and Dr. Gladwin is our chair of the Department of Medicine. who was recruited by Dr. Levine to the University of Pittsburgh. He's a pulmonologist by training and just a super high energy guy, and I look forward to working with him for many years. Dr. Kapoor has recently stepped down, and we had a national search. I see Dr. Jane Liebschutz here, our new division director. 23 years will be a tough record to beat from Dr. Kapoor, but we'll see what happens. Jane just started this week, and we've been friends for many years. And also I want to thank Dr. Levine. Dr. Levine came here about 20 years ago, and he's really catapulted the University of Pittsburgh, the School of Medicine, from about 20 or so in NIH funding to being fifth in the United States, which is a huge achievement. And again, it's really delighting. He's been excellent about working with people to attract new resources to the university. Now, the Endowed Chair is the UPMC Endowed Chair, so I also want to give a big thank you to UPMC and about making a difference. I want to thank in particular Dr. Steve Shapiro, who was Mark's predecessor as a chairman of medicine and was my boss's boss, Diane Holder, and other people at UPMC who really made this possible. I don't consider this like coming to work. It's really just a pleasure being here and being able to serve. I see in the audience a number of my patients here I'm really honored to take care of, ranging in all sorts of ages. And I'm just really, again, delighted. And I want to say thank you for your trust. I also want to thank there may be a couple people here that I'm missing, but my work as a primary care physician, I feel a little bit like a 10-in-1 Swiss Army knife. So you have to be collaborative, you have to be cross-disciplinary and work with a number of different people. On this picture are longtime friends and colleagues in psychiatry, psychology, cardiology, public health, statistics, and just in other fields, and we could not do this work without really bringing these teams together in terms of being creative, and we'll talk a little bit more when we get to the section on the wow factor. And then next, I'd like to thank our hardworking team. This is a picture of our team about a year ago or so at one of our holiday parties, and I'd like to thank everybody. Without them, I'd really have very little to say, which is honestly is the truth, and they know it. So without further ado, let's go over the outline. My presentation today is kind of in three parts. Because of the audience is composed of friends and family and colleagues and patients, it's biographical, and I tried to make my talk accessible to a wider audience. I want to start with some personal background and then discuss how my research interests involved, and finally close with finding the wow factor. So this is me as a little boy. That's not me. That's from Citizen Kane. Now, does anyone remember what is the key word in Citizen Kane? Anybody? What? Rosebud. That's right. Whoop. Okay. So what is the key word in Citizen Kane? It's rosebud. So for people of a certain generation who may be less familiar with the movie, this was the last words of Charles Foster Kane. And so I think about this too in terms of what is my personal rosebud. How did I get interested in being a physician? And for as long as I can remember even in kindergarten saying to people that I wanted to be a doctor. And how did I get this interest? And the truth is, to the best of my recollection, This is a picture of me when I was about a year old, and I'm being held up by my mom. And I spent much of my first year of my life in hospitals. I was a sick baby. I had some sort of intestinal issue. There's a colostomy over there. And I think the only thing I could think of is maybe to borrow a psychologic term of countertransference, that my parents would say, or the nurses would say, do this for the doctor, or do that for the doctor, that somehow I must have internalized that I wanted someday to become a doctor, even when I didn't quite have that knowledge. So this is me when I was the Gerber's baby, and I recovered from there. My parents had taken me around. They're not people of means, but they had taken me around to Philadelphia and to New York, and eventually Boston Children's Hospital, where there was a Dr. Robert Gross who had done surgery, and I had recovered. This is a picture of me with my brothers, my two older brothers. My brother Fred, who's here in the front row today on the right, and my brother Rick, who unfortunately was unable to be here. You could see then that my mother dressed them alike, but I was a rebellious one. We grew, and we grew some more, and we were also a little bit competitive too. So my oldest brother, who's here, he the one with the fist, he became an attorney, and my other brother behind me became a dentist. So it was kind of like the Jewish version of the Holy Trinity. On the other side, here are my parents, and this is in my 20s. And my father was born in Germany. He came to the United States as a refugee in 1936. It was after what they had, the Nuremberg laws, that kind of stripped Jewish citizens of their citizenship. So he was kicked out of school, and his mother, his father died when he was a little boy, and his mother, they were living in a small town near Frankfurt, that his mother had recognized that there was really no future for him in Germany, and he was fortunate enough to get out in the summer of 1936 and then to live with an aunt and uncle in New York. My mom in the middle, she went to college. She went to a Montclair State Teachers College, and then never quite worked as a teacher until I was older. But my dad also never went to college, and between that, I like to think we were very fortunate in terms of living an American dream, where my brothers and I each went to college and to graduate school, and our parents placed a very high premium on education. We grew up in a town called Cranford, which is about 15 miles away from New York City. It reminds me a little bit of Squirrel Hill, where we live right now, where there's sidewalks and the kids could walk to school and their friends' houses and so on. Nothing ever really happened in Cranford, I should say. But then I went off when I was 18 to college at the University of Pennsylvania, and I loved being in Philadelphia. I loved being at Penn. I loved being in Philadelphia. It was a great city, and learning about history and exploring. I really feel I grew up there. I liked it so much. I stayed in Philadelphia for medical school at Jefferson, and Jefferson's is an older medical college. I think it was founded about 1826 or so. The room on the top right is an auditorium, not unlike this one, where we would spend many hours in lecture from like 8 to 5 or so on. I'm sure it's different now at Pitt Med, where it's much more exciting, but it wasn't so much then in the 1980s. Is Ken Smith in the room? Ken Smith. Dr. Ken Smith is a colleague of mine in our Division of General Internal Medicine. That's a picture of his father, Harry. And Harry was one of my early mentors at Jefferson. He was a professor of microbiology, but you see from his class portrait is an Apple Macintosh in the back. And I think by that time in his career, I can't speak to, he must have been good because he got promoted to professor, and he eventually got a class portrait. But the big thing was the Apple Macintosh. And from Harry, I developed an interest in computers. So at Jefferson, at Scott Library, in 1984, they bought computers, and I never touched a computer when I was at Penn, but I started getting really interested in that. Classes were kind of long, the days were long, and I was looking for something else to do. I also got to medical school. Remember, like from a very early age, all I wanted to do was to become a doctor. And I don't know if I really thought about the decision. I didn't have a gap year. I kind of went all straight through. And I felt a little bit like Ben in the movie The Graduate. You know, if anyone's seen it, at the end of the movie, he and Elaine run out on the bus, and they're like, oh my gosh, what have we just done? And that's how a little bit how I felt in medical school. What was I doing here in medical school? But then serendipity hit. And in the spring of 1985, we had just finished our freshman anatomy classes, and I went home to New Jersey to ride my bicycle. And I had a really great time, a really great ride. The next day I went to ride again, but I just couldn't sit on the seat. I was totally saddle sore, and I had just taken anatomy, and I thought, maybe we could design an anatomically correct seat that bridges the bones that you're sitting on right now, you know, and doesn't put on any pressure in the middle. So I was playing around with the Macintosh and Mac Paint and Mac Draw and so on, and I came up with my first patent. Worked on it for about 5 years with the help of mechanical engineers and machine shops and so on. And I was able to develop a bicycle seat and test. And I always wanted a patent. Just like becoming a doctor, it was on my bucket list. So 1988, this is a graduation day for medical school with my parents. If you notice here, my mom is wearing very heavy glasses. So my mom had chronic glaucoma and macular degeneration. And although she was a smart lady, she was going blind and had stopped driving in the early 1980s, and just couldn't read because of her visual impairment. My father, when I was a sophomore, the fall of my sophomore year in medical school, my father was diagnosed with metastatic renal cell cancer or kidney cancer. And he eventually found treatment at Sloan Kettering in New York. He did very well. And then in December of my senior year of medical school, he underwent surgery again to have a brain metastasis removed. And when he came home from the hospital, he was on a bunch of medications, and I could see that my mother was going to mess up his pills pretty quickly. She couldn't read the labels. I happened to be home on break. She couldn't read his medicine bottles. And, whether twice a day, 3 times a day, 4 times a day were some of these. So I came across the idea of putting on brightly colored tape and putting so that my mom wouldn't have to read the labels. So red would be maybe once a day, black might be twice a day, and so on. This was not our refrigerator, but just to illustrate the point. So I put the key on with the refrigerator, and that way my mom was able to figure out the medications. So I went back to Jefferson for my last term in the spring of 1988, January 1988. I went to talk to ophthalmologists at Wills Eye Hospital and also internists who cared for visually impaired people. I went to the Patent Library in Philadelphia, the Library for the Blind, and became familiar with the topic of medication adherence. And this has also been a theme of my work. I have a number of my patients are in the audience today. And when we meet, we sit down, we go over your medications to make sure I have everything up to date and that you can afford your medications and you're taking them correctly and so on. But this was a really big issue that I discovered. And so by this point, I developed this. I moved on to the University of Maryland, as Dr. Levine mentioned, after graduation. And during my internship year was a little bit too busy. But during my second year, my residency, my dad had passed away, but I was totally smit with the idea of these bottle caps. And I started writing this grant application. I'd get off from work, I'd have dinner, and then I'd be writing to midnight, or I'd be writing and then I bought a computer so I didn't want to walk around in Baltimore after midnight from the library back and forth. So I bought a computer with moonlighting money, and I'd be writing till 2 a.m. and then get to work at 7 the next day. And I wrote a grant application to test the bottle caps I had designed here in a randomized clinical trial at the VA. And let's see, here are the bottle caps here. We got another patent on them. And you can see they had brightly colored tops and braille and raised letters and numbers so that a person like my mother could figure out the medications in various ways. There was an easy opening top called a living hinge, like what you see on a shampoo bottle. So if you had bad arthritis, you didn't have to spin a top open. But the general idea was then to move on and test this in a randomized trial. And it was early health services research. The general idea was that half the patients, the veterans at the Baltimore VA, would be discharged with these bottle caps, and half would be the standard way of discharge from the VA. And then we would look at things like refill records and readmissions and so on. So this was the grant application. I found a faculty mentor, Conrad May, who was a geriatrician, and we submitted. We got a good review locally and regionally, but at the national level, we got, well, it was good, but the grant wasn't good enough to get funded. I think we were asking for all of $50,000, and most of the money would have gone for to make the bottle caps, the molds, and so on. And the advice from the study section was for the PI, then I was about 28 years old, was to get formal research training. So that was my motivation for doing the General Internal Medicine Fellowship at Johns Hopkins, and I did an MPH with a focus on epidemiology, which is kind of like applied statistics. I got involved with projects on HIV, on adherence with HIV medications and adherence with medications after hospital discharge. And then one day, my fellowship director, early in my senior year of my fellowship, Eric Bass, who was a chief resident at the University of Pittsburgh and trained with Dr. Kapoor here, one day he called me in his office, and Eric asked me if I was interested in looking at a job in Pittsburgh. And I thought to myself, Pittsburgh? What did I know about Pittsburgh? I knew about Steele and Andrew Carnegie, and this had been my concept of the city before I came. I knew about the Steelers. I knew about the Pirates. I liked Flashdance. And I was a little familiar, although I had grown out of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So that's about all that I knew. It was really like a kind of a stereotype of what was Pittsburgh. And at the time, this was my then fiance and wife, Jane. Jane has a business background, and Jane said to me, well, they're going to pay your ticket, the hotel, all that kind of stuff. So why don't you go? It'll be a good opportunity to practice your job talk. Because I figured I'd always grown up around I-95 and trained. I thought we'd be in Philadelphia, Washington, or Baltimore. So I listened to Jane, and I took the advice to come over here, and I was just wowed by Wishwa's vision for building, and we were nothing like what we've become. I don't think I can get my job today if we were applying, but I was very fortunate to get in on the ground floor. So in July 1995, the summer of 1995, I joined our division of General Internal Medicine, and it's been terrific. Exciting environment. Dr. Kapoor built this health services research group, our Center for Research on Healthcare. The clinical activities were terrific. We have the flagship primary care practice for UPMC, and honestly, it's a delight to go in and to serve my patients and to work in the environment that Wishwa and Gary Fisher and others have created. So then the next question, moving along, now we're in Pittsburgh, how did I get interested in depression? Nobody in my family had depression to the best of my knowledge. If I was depressed, it might have been in the ICU when I was an intern, working every third night and so on, but nobody in my family had that history. This is not Dr. Kapoor pulling me aside. This is also from The Graduate. If you haven't seen it, it's a terrific movie. So how I got interested in part was through my grandmother-in-law. My mother-in-law, Linda, her mother, Florence Kaplan. So a few weeks in the summer of 1995, in July 1995, I thought I'd come back to Pittsburgh and I'd go back to work with medication adherence and so on. And a few weeks after we arrived, my grandmother-in-law, Florence, broke her hip. She fell. She was about 86 years old, previously very active woman, broke her hip. She became depressed. She stopped her rehab. She stopped eating. But fortunately, her doctors called in a geriatric psychiatrist who recognized the depression, started on medications, and she subsequently recovered, went back to driving and living independently up until maybe a couple months before she died. Now, should she have been driving is another story, but she went back. The depression was recognized, and she went back to a healthy, active life. The other event that happened in the summer of 1995 was meeting Dr. Charlie Schulberg, who's here from New York, with his wife Phyllis. So Dr. Kapoor has new faculty interview with people around the schools of the health sciences to identify a mentor. and to identify, a senior investigator who'd be more than just an advisor, but really to take somebody under their wing. And I remember meeting Dr. Schulberg for the first time in his office when it was in Iroquois, and I think it was a Friday afternoon after lunch, and I was like falling asleep. Because Charlie was writing something on the board, and he must have thought, this is a very dull boy over here. He's not going to be here for very long. But Charlie has been truly like a mentor and a second father. He was involved with early trials of treating depression in primary care and was a co-author of the HCPR guidelines that the picture here is on the side for national care guidelines for treating depression in primary care. And Charlie has been my wise mentor and senior counselor ever since. He retired from the university in 2000 and moved to New York and worked part-time for the next 10, 11 years at Cornell, but we remain in a regular contact by phone, by email, and so on. Initially, when my writing, Charlie would just mark it up in red, so I apologize if I've done that to Charles and other mentees to get their things back in red. It's just how I learned, Charles. I'm sorry. I'm glad that Charlie didn't beat me, Let's leave it at that. But through Charlie and my own initiative, I learned about depression in primary care. And what I learned is that it's the second most common chronic disorder to present in primary care settings. It's often unrecognized, inadequately treated, very much associated with suicide. But remember, I had this interest in adherence. So the other thing I learned is that primary care physicians were poorly adherent with these national guidelines that Charlie and others had helped develop. And patients who were depressed were poorly adherent with the rest of their medical care, like their medications, recommended changes in diet and exercise, quitting smoking, and so on. If you're depressed, you're much less likely to do that. So I wrote my first grants on faculty here, my first year. I wrote a K award, a training award, with Charlie as a primary mentor to look at how depression was treated in primary care and comparing it to specialty care. And about a month or so after it was funded, I saw a grant announcement from AHRQ that had developed those guidelines, looking for new ideas to use their guidelines with electronic health records. So WISHWA was very thoughtful and far-thinking, and in 1996, our practice had an electronic medical record system called Logician installed much earlier than the one that we use now called Epic. But WISHWA was very far thinking about that, and I wrote a grant application to HRQ to deploy their guideline, to use the EMR to implement guideline-based care. And lo and behold, I had 0 papers to my name, 0 published papers, no recognized expertise in the area. But we submitted the grant in June, and in early September, I got a call from a project officer saying they wanted to fund our grant. And away we went. I mean, it was just amazing. I mean, it was really the fastest that the grant got funded. They had about 95 applications and funded 5. And I was one, and I was probably the only one who had 0 publications to his name. The general idea was to tell doctors about their screen in the clinic for depression, inform the doctors and tell them actively and passively and give them advice. So at the end of the day, the bottom line is it didn't make a difference. So whether you told the doctor that the patient was depressed or not, and whether you gave direct guidance through the electronic medical record, it had no impact on whether or not patients recovered. And I thought at the time it was because I was a new investigator, non-experienced, but there were 2 other people, David Bates at the Brigham and Harvard, who was funded on the same program, and he had a negative study for diabetes care, and Bill Tierney at Regent Strife in Indianapolis, also very distinguished senior investigator, and he had a negative trial for heart failure care. So it made me to think, okay, the EMR is good for one-time only things like flu shots and mammograms and cholesterol screens, but it was less good for chronic illness care. So this is kind of Charlie's advice. So I thought I needed a new model of treatment. So it's too hard to change physician behavior care. Let's work on patients. And around that time, in the mid-1990s, a fellow by the name of Ed Wagner at Group Health Cooperative in Seattle had developed the chronic care model. And we have now used that model in our last 5 clinical trials that 4 have reported, 1's still underway. All of them have been positive, successful studies. The chronic care model is also known as collaborative care or the patient-centered medical home, which is linked to primary care. It's a team approach with care managers who telephone patients or send emails to follow up. It's proactive. They use registries. Rather than wait for patients to show up in the office, they go down a registry, they see who's severely depressed or whose diabetes or blood pressure is not under control, and they telephone those patients. And then the goal is to promote self-care. Because in a typical year, 525,600 minutes, how many minutes do you actually spend with your primary care physician or other healthcare providers? So it's really, really critical to get patients involved with their own care. And finally, this is evidence-based. We're using those guidelines that are developed rather than just haphazard treatment. So these are some of our publications, but I like them by the logos. We've been working with this model since the late 1990s. Our study team has done among the first trials in the country to look at collaborative care over the phone for treating panic and generalized anxiety. Our bypassing the blues trial that I'll talk about in a moment. Our online treatment trial that look for it coming out in one of the JAMA journals this fall used an internet support group and a computerized CBT program, and it allowed UPMC patients to communicate with one another and provide support. And then finally, our Hopeful Heart trial, which is underway. In fact, I just heard from my project coordinator this morning, Amy Anderson, we just enrolled our 705th patient, making it our largest trial. Online treatment was 704, and we're on target to get to the full 750 by early November. And we'll open the study blind another year to see if treating heart failure and depression can reduce mortality, improve health-related quality of life, and so on. So I want to focus a little bit scientifically. Okay, why am I here? It's not just with the biography, but to talk about some of our scientific work. This is our paper that appeared in JAMA in the fall of 2009, the main outcomes paper from our bypassing the blues trial. And the bottom line is that telephone treatment, collaborative care for treatment of depression following cardiac bypass surgery speeds recovery. When the paper came out, it was like, wow, this is it, holding it up and stuff, that this was it. At that time, it was 11 years of work to get to that point. 11 years of work. It took almost 5 years from the time we came up with the idea to get funded from NIH, and then we executed the project, and we're still publishing papers. Earlier this year, we submitted the 10-year mortality experience follow-up on the bypass study. So, and it all started really one day in the spring of 1998. I was reading the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and there was an article in the science paper about women not doing as well as men after bypass surgery. And I was thinking, I wonder why women didn't do as well as men. And, they speculate, this is it's a study of almost 350,000 bypass patients from the Thoracic Surgery Society, and they tracked all these kind of outcome measures. They adjusted for things like age and heart function and how many bypass grafts one had. And it still fell out that being a woman was an independent risk factor for mortality. But why? Nobody knew. There was speculation about women having smaller blood vessels than men. So later that week, this is one of my other mentors, Dr. Chip Reynolds. And Chip had an NIH-funded late life mood disorder center. And that week, he happened to invite people to his home for his annual external advisory committee. So he had a cocktail reception in his living room, and I happened to be making small talk with Chip. And I asked him if he saw that article in the paper. And I said to him, I wonder if it was because of depression that the women didn't do as well as men. Because we know that women are twice as likely to have depression than men. But this paper, I went back and I found it, they had nothing on depression in there. And maybe that was it. And Chip said to me, that is interesting. Maybe you want to look into that. Now, he didn't tell me to look into it, but it really became a 19-year journey starting from his living room. I started scratching the surface, too, and I found, as I was doing my literature searches in the field, I found this classic paper by Dr. Nancy Fraser-Smith from the Montreal Heart Institute. And this is a landmark paper. It's been cited nearly 3,000 times. And the bottom line is this. She screened patients who survived a heart attack at the Montreal Heart Institute, 222 patients. 16% of those patients met criteria for major depression. And if you had major depression after your heart attack, 17% of those people were dead in 6 months versus 3% of people had died if you weren't depressed. That's huge. That's a 14% difference. And at the time, and I was thinking to myself, wow, 14%. If you treat depression and it could cut that in half, that's 7%. That's huge, compared to some of the other things we do today, like with bypass surgery and stents and statins and so on. If we can cut mortality by 7%, that would be an enormous boon to people. So eventually, I raised about $250,000 from CHIP, from David Kupfer in the Department of Psychiatry with his center, from WISHWA as part of my startup package at the university, and other sources to do the pilot work that led to the Bypassing the Blues trial. I had no papers in this area. I had a bunch of abstracts. I was going to American Psychosomatic Society meetings and networking with project officers and people in the field, but I had no really significant published papers, and we were able to get a $5.5 million grant. So I was extremely lucky to be doing that. Bypassing the Blues enrolled patients from 7 Pittsburgh area hospitals, including competitor hospitals of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center. So it was, here I was an early associate professor, and it took some doing to get people on board, but they did, and they contributed. The bottom line is collaborative care for post-CABG depression reduces mood symptoms. So another innovation to our study is we had a non-depressed comparison group, and that's that greenish line at the bottom, because we thought also some of these patients are going to die, some are going to get readmitted, some are going to develop depression. So it'd be really important not only to have an intervention group and usual care group, but also a non-depressed comparison group of bypass patients. So that's the line at the bottom. So here we found the main findings from our paper: collaborative care reduced mood symptoms and improved health-related quality of life, and also very importantly, it saves money. So this is a paper we published with Julie Donahoe at the Graduate School of Public Health, and it took about 5 years to do after our main paper came out. We got Medicare claims, UPMC health plan data, and Highmark data, all together, and Julie and her analyst analyzed this, and we found that if you were randomized to the intervention in the 12 months after discharge, it saved the system about $2,000 in medical costs. And the other thing I want to point out, remember I mentioned with the non-depressed comparison group, look at the median costs between if you don't have depression and how much depression adds. So regardless of whether or not, these people, when you look at the JAMA paper, they didn't differ by medical comorbidity like hypertension and cholesterol and a cardiac ejection fraction. Depression alone more than tripled the healthcare claims in the year after bypass. So when we put this, let's compare Bypassing the Blues to other studies. In healthcare and medicine, we have something called the quality adjusted life year. And in the United States, if something is considered $50,000 to buy an additional quality adjusted life year, it's considered a good value. If it's under $20,000, it's considered high value care. So as you can see here, some of the other studies done in primary care for treating depression and anxiety, it's high value care to use these collaborative care models for treating depression and anxiety disorders. And on the bottom are things that are more traditional medical care. So for treating angina with bypass surgery or medications, or screening middle-aged men for hyperlipidemia, for cholesterol, or treating type 2 diabetes, they're all cost effective, but only treating depression after bypass surgery was not only cost effective, but cost savings. So you get more quality adjusted life years at a lower cost. And there are very, very, very few things in healthcare, in medicine, that do that. Maybe prenatal care and a couple of vaccines. And if anyone wants to comment, almost nothing else does that in medical care. So that gets to the next point about impact. So in my view, too many studies sit on the shelf unused. And what I've tried to have for my own career, by the time that it's done, I don't think I'm going to have hundreds of papers like Dr. Chip Reynolds, but I'll have a number of papers, and I want to see our work get used. It's not enough to just publish a paper and move on. So I think about that in terms of impact, because there's no drug company money in our studies. These were all NIH funded, except for some of the cost data was finished with a small grant from the Fine Foundation that I'm thankful for to support Julie's time. But what about the impact? So our work is regularly cited by the American Heart Association and other national care guidelines when you look in the bibliographies that call for routine treatment of depression after cardiac events. Our work is also, interestingly, going back, remember that paper with the database I mentioned, a CHIP? The STS, Society for Thoracic Surgeons database, as of January 2014, now includes measures of depression. So now, and we're starting to see reports come out, and this is what I really wanted to do, is it's not enough just to publish a paper and get promoted. Believe me, it feels great. But the other thing is to really get our work used. And more recently, in January 2015, we launched an initiative with UPMC Health Plan for behavioral health, physical health integrative project to screen all health plan patients who've survived a heart attack. And what we do is we develop this checklist, thinking about Atul Gawande's work and our own team's work of using checklists to improve quality of care. ABCC, really simple, ACE beta blocker, clotting agents and cholesterol agents, DEFF, depression, exercise or cardiac rehab, financial, can your patients afford their medications, and do they have a follow-up appointment? This is a really, really simple checklist. We trained the health plan care managers on this, and Patty Houck at the health plan and James Schuster recently reported that they saved nearly $1 million in the first year compared to year over year, and it was almost $400 per patient, just using this simple checklist. The other area that we moved into is heart failure. And this is work that we had a pilot study, from NIH to do. We screened patients with something called the PHQ-2, feeling down, depressed, or hopeless, tired, or little energy most days. We did this at Presby, Passavant, Shadyside, and St. Margaret's Hospital. And 471 patients. If heart failure patients screened positive for depression, 20% of those patients were dead in a year compared to 8% of patients who screened negative. So it's a little like Nancy Fraser-Smith's earlier work that I showed. And when we adjusted for things like gender, ejection fraction, kidney function, diabetes, et cetera, it was still a 3 times increased risk of mortality a year later. And that work eventually led to our current Hopeful Heart trial that I mentioned, is testing a blended model of collaborative care. So in the bypass study, our nurses just treated the depression. In the Hopeful Heart trial, we have a team of nurses who are doing a blended model of treating depression and heart failure together versus another team of nurses who are treating just the heart failure alone and the usual care control group. So Hopeful Heart is up and running in 8 hospitals. As you can see here, it's almost all are UPMC except for St. Clair. I'd watch out if I were St. Clair, but anyway, it's and we're also moving into cardiac rehab. So our latest study we hope to submit next month is using the collaborative care model to improve cardiac rehab. There's huge gaps where patients are not getting cardiac rehab that we've identified in Hopeful Heart, as well as our initiative with the health plan. So the working title of this project is NEST, for nutrition, exercise, social, and time management. Why time management? Because a lot of my patients tell me they don't have time to exercise, they don't have time to eat, they don't have time to do whatever to take care of their health. So I thought maybe we could train them up in basic goal setting and time management skills to improve their health. So look for this next. So I want to close with a couple words on the where to find the wow factor. So I think, what do I mean by the wow factor? It's kind of like looking for that. It's hard to put it into words, but you kind of know it when you see it. Something that makes your work really special, and that people will recognize and say, "Oh yeah, why didn't I think of this before?" Maybe it's the iPhone with a glass screen and something like that. Maybe what was your reaction the first time that you saw a smartphone? Did you go, "Wow, I never saw anything like this before"? What is the wow factor, and where do you find that? So I think the first stage is with curiosity. This is a picture of my daughter Emily at the Phipps when she was a little girl, and I think you have to have that kind of curiosity as like a kid and be interested in the world. The other thing is I think it's really important to learn from your patients and your friends and your family's experiences. So I didn't mention other things that we did with our work developing an EKG recording device. It's my third and fourth patents. These all came from ideas from seeing family members' struggles, from seeing patient struggles, and then thinking, why does it have to be like this? How could we do this better? One of my favorite quotes is from Louis Pasteur about chance favoring the prepared mind. And what do I mean by that? So if you go out there, if you read a lot, if you read broadly, you're more likely to notice something when it happens that you recognize. So in addition to reading, like, at least skimming the table of contents each week from the New England Journal and JAMA and the traditional medical journals, people who know me know I read the New York Times every day. I look at the Wall Street Journal because there's a lot of health news in there, the Washington Post. I like to read Harvard Business Review and other kind of magazines just to get ideas. And it's kind of like a mashup to how to inform my own work with these ideas, because you never know. And then I know we've talked about, some of my patients are in the room and they'll say, oh, I saw this article on NPR or this article in the New York Times, and we'll kind of discuss that and how it relates to their issues. The other thing I think is also really important to do to find the wow factor is not only to travel to attend meetings, but also to engage with professional organizations. So I never would have had the bypass study funded if I didn't get involved with the American Psychosomatic Society, because of the investigators who were doing the cutting edge work, the Nancy Fraser Smiths, the Ken Friedlands, and others, were attending these meetings and presenting work before it became published. So it was really important to see when it was works in progress and abstracts, and walking there and meeting also new investigators who might have some new ideas, and just to get involved. I'm the incoming president for the American Psychosomatic Society, which is a great honor. My professional home is the Society for General Internal Medicine. I've probably gone to every meeting, maybe except for one when we're on sabbatical. Wishwa was the president when I was a fellow, was the president of the meeting, and it was just a great way of making, and Jane and I have met through SGIM, and this is just a great way of developing professional relations. And then the other thing is networking. So what do I mean by networking? These are pictures from our conferences, our Center for Behavioral Health and Smart Technology conferences recently. So it's just important to meet other people, to bring them in, and to exchange ideas. We have our upcoming conference this November is on the right. And I'm really blessed, and I'm very thankful to Wishwa and to Mark for providing these resources to launch our center, as well as for the chair to support, to bring in speakers and so on. We got also funding from the provost office to bring together with our conferences the Katz School of Business. So we have, as I mentioned before, and Dr. Levine has helped to create one of the top 5 NIH-funded medical centers in the United States. But the Katz School literally sits on the periphery, just off Schenley Plaza, and has not been very involved with healthcare, which kind of seems like a shame. We've sent other people like the Tepper, which is a great school also, but how do we get Katz involved? So we sent a proposal to the provost office that they funded last year and renewed our funding for this year to bring the Katz School closer to the schools of the health sciences. And I'm pleased to work with Jeff Inman, who's one of the deans there, in organizing these conferences. And then finally, these are just ideas, and I would just be a guy with ideas if we didn't execute on the ideas. And I remember when I was in college, talking to one of my roommates who would say, "Oh, I'm an ideas person. Every day I get a couple of new ideas, and you think about it. But the key thing is execution." And in the summer of 2003, when we got our bypass study funded, I read this excellent book by Jim Collins called From Good to Great. I highly recommend it. Jim Collins is a business school faculty at Stanford, and it's about how all these companies went from good to great over a 40-year period and so on. And one of the key principles at the beginning was getting the right people on the bus, the wrong people off the bus, and the right people in the right seats. And I know Wishwa and I have kind of shared that kind of bus analogy too. And for me personally, the right person on the bus is Dr. B. Belknap. And B came in from Germany for my presentation this week. And B and I have been working together since 2000. And she moved to the United States in 1998. And we started working together on a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded project with Harold Pincus on treating depression in primary care. And since then, very closely from 2000 to 2015, we've worked extremely close together B is really had been my chief operating officer until she went back to Germany in 2015, and now we communicate regularly. But she was the right person on the bus to kind of put a measure of, how would you say, German efficiency and attention to detail into our projects. And then trained our current project coordinator, Amy Anderson, to apply that same rigor to our studies. The other thing I've learned is that this is hard work. So when I was a boy also, and I still do, I love to read biographies and histories and so on, and I always wanted a patent like Edison. And one of his famous quotes is about genius being 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And I didn't really appreciate it when I was, 8 or 10 years old or so on, but I do now. And, again, the bottom line for this is that these projects are a lot of work, and they're a lot of effort and organizing teams of people to execute. So that's another key. And the other thing, when I was putting together this presentation, I learned about the growth mindset. And I hadn't realized this, but this is something that I have. Carol Dweck is at Stanford, and she wrote a book about this. And the growth mindset is about learning from mistakes. And, if you're going into an academic career, or maybe you're going to law or some other kind of field, there's always disappointments. There are grants that don't get funded. There's papers that get rejected. An employee doesn't work out as you hope for, and so on. So you always think about these challenges and how could you grow from that, as opposed to just saying, well, it's time to pack up and quit. And that gets into the issue on grit. So Angela Duckworth is a professor of psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, and a MacArthur Genius Award winner, and had published his book the other year on grit. And I'll just read here for a moment. Grit is having stamina. Grit is sticking with your future day in and day out, not just for the week, not just for the month, but for the years. So this takes a lot of time. And this is a picture. This is on December 10th, 1996, when my daughter Emily was born. And so you can see over here, there's almost no gray hair. And this has taken a lot of time to do this. And it also takes a lot of family support. And I want to acknowledge my wife, Jane, over here. In addition to having a full-time job herself, Jane organizes the birthday parties, the soccer carpools, the regular carpools, the dinner parties, the groceries. If I do the groceries, she'll get mad at what I buy. But that's another story. Ladies, you can relate. But she really makes it happen, and having that kind of family support and trust at home has really allowed me to do what I do. And Jane, thank you. So I also want to thank my kids. So you can see how they've grown a little bit. So my oldest, that kid who was looking through the tree, that was Emily. My hand is on Emily's shoulder. So she couldn't be here today. She's a junior at Tulane, and she's in Copenhagen on a semester abroad studying urban planning. My son, Mark, came in, totally surprised me because of Jane organizing this. He's in the Honors College at the University of Michigan, and a sophomore. And my daughter, Rachel, who's a senior at Alderdice. And so I'm really delighted the kids are here, and they'll be here for the reception. I also want to thank the other side of my family, who've taught me a lot. So we have here my mother-in-law, Linda Miller. And Linda is like my own mother, being a kind person and also pushing education, and being tremendously supportive to her family, as Jane and my sister-in-law, Karen, who's over there next to her, who came in from Baltimore today, are. And my father-in-law, Howard Miller, who's there on the far right. And Howard is an incredibly generous person and also very civically minded, as is my brother Fred and my other brother Rick, and we try to learn by example. So I just want to acknowledge him and say thank you. My mother would be very proud of this picture because we're still dressed alike. This is actually a brother's family vacation this summer. The wives came too, but I think she would like that. And again, thank you very much for your attention. I'm very, again, grateful to UPMC, to Dr. Levine, to Dr. Gladwin, and Dr. Kapoor. Thank you.
We do have a few moments for questions or comments for Bruce. Anyone with a question or a comment? Perhaps I can ask you, Bruce. There are other psychological misadventures and challenges that patients in primary care face. Obsessive compulsive disorders, for example, and a whole array of illnesses that probably could be treated in primary care as opposed to psychiatric clinics. But that suggests to me that perhaps our medical school curricula is more feeble than it should be with regard to introducing this notion of treating affective and behavioral disorders in primary care settings pari passu with every other illness that we more traditionally identify in primary care. Could you comment on that?
Sure. Well, two things. I should also gratefully acknowledge Dr. Levine's support. In around 2005, Dr. Levine supported, I think we had a grant from your office for about $50,000 to integrate depression treatment into in the PBL curriculum, practice-based learning curriculum. And we worked together with Jason Rosenstock and others to develop a PBL, or practice-based learning, for the second-year medical students to integrate depression as with comorbid medical illness. And we designed PBLs, and we presented at AAMC conferences together. So I want to thank you for your leadership in that area. I think that there's a lot. I mean, I think, again, when I was a medical student in the 1980s and a house staff, people didn't talk about so much depression. You got a psych consult if it was recognized. But the treatment is relatively straightforward for most people. And not everyone requires medications, as we do in the Hopeful Heart Project. It's engagement with friends. It's quitting drinking and drugs. It's just getting going. Some people do require medications, but the medications aren't as great as I think that people would have hoped for. But I definitely think that it's really key to recognize that depression, I mentioned 5 to 9% in primary care populations. It's double or triple that in populations on dialysis. We just recently got a grant funded with Mashish Jam on that for treating dialysis patients for depression, with cancer patients. It's tremendously common, and I think it should be kind of incorporated across the medical curriculum. Thank you.
Well, I think there are probably many more comments and questions, but let's reserve them for the reception, which we will hold now up in the lobby for Dr. Rollman. But before we eat and drink, let's have another round of applause for a wonderful speaker. Thank you, Miguel, and especially to the kids in the front row. Good.